Welcome to Voices of International Relations, the Asia podcast, where global conversations come alive right here at Ashoka University.
A.S.I.A, or the Ashoka Society for International Affairs. And we are on a mission to make international relations not just accessible, but absolutely compelling.
As Ashoka's premier IR society, connected to a young IR department in Sonipat, we're a community of curious minds, passionate about understanding the complex tapestry of global interactions from interdisciplinary lenses.
And this podcast is our platform to bring the most brilliant minds in international relations directly to you. No jargon, no unnecessary complexity, just honest, nuanced conversations that make you think, question, and see the world differently.
Today, we're incredibly excited to host the inaugural episode of the Asia podcast, Voices of International Relations. This week's theme is non traditional security as a lead up to our annual IR conference on April 11th, 2025. The theme is Global Risks, Local Impacts, Non Traditional Security in the Modern Era. And what better way to sorry, right. And what better way to set the stage than with a conversation that promises to unravel the intricate layers of global security?
We have a guest who needs no introduction, but we'll introduce him anyways.
Our guest today has walked the corridors of diplomatic power, shaped India's strategic thinking, and continues to be a leading voice in understanding our rapidly changing world. I'm incredibly happy to welcome our first guest, the former National Security Advisor, ambassador to multiple countries, and now a distinguished scholar, Professor Shivshankar Menon.
From the diplomatic missions of Israel and China to the corridors of power in New Delhi, Professor Menon has been at the heart of India's strategic decision making. He is a distinguished fellow at CSEP, chair for the Center of China Studies, and a visiting professor at our beloved Ashoka University. He has served as India's ambassador to Israel, Sri Lanka, China, and Pakistan. Now that's impressive. He was India's Foreign Secretary from 2006 to 2009 and a National Security Advisor from 2010 to 2014. He recently published a book, India in a World Adrift, which is a Lowy Institute paper published as a Penguin Special.
So, whether you're a student of IR, a policy enthusiast, or simply a Shiv Shankar Menon fan, this is a conversation you don't want to miss.
Professor Menon, welcome to the A.S.I.A podcast.
Thank you for having me. Good of you to ask me.
So let's begin. Nandika, what do you think about non-traditional security? What is it? Can you tell me a little bit about it?
If I were to describe it more simply, I'd say anything non military in nature that is some sort of an existential threat for humanity would come under non traditional security. I'm thinking things like climate security, health security, food security. Professor Manin, what do you think about non traditional security if you were to define it?
Well, you're absolutely right. It depends on how you define security. Whether if you start defining it in terms of human security, then even non-existential threats, I mean threats which, but threats to prosperity, threats to security, to safety, those become non-traditional security threats. Pandemics, for instance. May not be existential threats, but they certainly are a non-traditional threat. Energy security, for instance, can affect your future very, very profoundly. So there's a whole host of, once you expand beyond the traditional hard power instruments, beyond military and economic power, you then get into a whole host of issues. In fact, the problem is prioritizing between because all states have limited means. And strategy is really an ends and means problem. I mean, how many threats can you which ones are the more direct, the more existential, of course, will take priority over others. But it seems to me that that's really where national security strategy comes in, and where you have difficult choices to make.
Well, that's a really well way to put it. And I, just like he says and you said as well, I feel like, it's something not just non-military in nature, but also something that encompasses so many other aspects of governance and policy that we usually don't think about in, the traditional international relations or war studies sort of ambit. But now that our audience knows about what non-traditional security is, let's start with the first question and hit the deck with the podcast.
So, Professor Menon, what role does non traditional themes of security play in the larger picture of policy making?
Uh, I think it's always present in the background, certainly. But policy decisions don't present themselves as here's your choice, your grand strategic choice. They present themselves as a series of small individual decisions which then add up. So, to a certain extent, decisions are path dependent because you're already on a certain path. And secondly, they're driven by events which are not necessarily under your control. Aaron McMillan, when he was Prime Minister of Britain, was asked, what keeps you awake at night? And he said, events, dear boy, events, because that's unpredictable. That's the bit that is. So, yes, non traditional security issues will be at the back of your mind and are something that you worry about all the time. But at moments of crisis, at moments when the world system itself is undergoing change, at these moments, and I think we are at one probably now, if you look at international relations, at those moments, certainly these become much, much more important because they then come. We saw when the COVID crisis hit, then frankly, that pandemic just took over everybody's calculus. And everybody on earth, nobody could say, yeah, that's not my problem. Somebody else will take care of it. Everybody had to worry about it. So, depending on crisis and depending on the moment, but it's always there at the back of your mind. I mean, it's not as though you can then handle the pandemic if you haven't done the preparations, if you don't have a working medical institutions, if you don't have the knowledge, the ability to produce vaccines, etc., the science, the basis, the social and the scientific and technological basis to deal with it, then you can take decisions. Otherwise, frankly, your choices are very limited. You then become just a recipient of other people's policies.
Well, um, with what Professor is saying, I'm reminded of this quote. I don't know who said it, but it's something about it that, in crisis, the most important things is the decisions and the choices you make, right? And Professor has a book called Choices Inside the Decision Making of India's Foreign Policy. And over there, you discuss the geopolitical decision making and, those related policy making choices. My question to you is, how do non-traditional security threats complicate the traditional diplomatic strategies that, India has had, or, the world has had? How does it sort of go past the traditional strategy?
I think if you look at India after independence, uh, before independence, the Raj looked at security in purely traditional terms. Internal security was just a law and order problem, and external security was just a question of securing India from outside invasion and attack and seeing off any other powers who maybe looked like attacking this, whether it was for Raj, it was Russia, and later it was China, it was Japan during World War II. Initially, right at the beginning, it was France as well, in the Napoleonic Wars. But once he became independent, he had a much broader view of security. I think partly this was forced on us by our experience. Secondly, by the condition to which India had been reduced by 150 years of colonialism. India was in a pretty abject state. So once our goal became the transformation of India, then you had to start looking at all the things that could prevent the transformation of India, the things that threaten your achieving your goals, your national goals. And then your definition of security became much broader. Then you start investing even in, things like investment in education and health. All this becomes actually important for your long-term security and your ability to cope with the environment, to create an environment within which you can transform India. So you're not just looking at military threats. You're not just looking at the traditional parts of hard power, even though that you cannot ignore. That's the basis. Without that, the rest of it, frankly, doesn't work. That's the basis. It's essential. But you then need to go beyond that to building other forms of resilience in society, to building other capabilities and strengths within society. And I think that's really what we've been doing. Uh, if you look at India today, she has capabilities that, frankly, we could only dream of in the 50s and 60s, soon after independence. And that makes a big difference to our security. Today, I would say that there's no existential threat to India. Until the late 70s, early 80s, people would write articles about, the breakup of India and what's going to happen. Books used to be written by all kinds of pundits. But there isn't a serious secessionist movement in India today. And there's no real external existential threat to India. There are threats to India, certainly, to our security, to our peace, and to our economic, to our prosperity, to our economic well-being and our past. But they are not existential in that sense, as we knew them earlier. And that's because we built certain capability and have grown to a certain size and ability now.
Professor, building on your answer about the neighborhood, drawing from your experience as ambassador to China and Pakistan, how do regional dynamics influence non-traditional security strategies?
Well, actually, the region is exactly where most of these non-traditional security issues uh, need to be handled first. Whether it's migration, whether it's energy security. One reason for that, whether it's pandemics, for instance, health issues, because they don't recognize borders. Most non-traditional security issues are transnational issues. There are
Yeah.
bilateral issues. And because they're transnational issues, they cross borders, they need cooperative solutions. They need several countries to actually work together on these issues. This is different from some bilateral boundary dispute or territorial dispute or things which constitute most of the causes of traditional security issues. So, given that fact, and in our region especially, if you think of it, we are dealing with, they may be old nations, but relatively new states. These are all states in the process of being formed. Pakistan was formed only in 1947. Burma used to be administered out of Calcutta until 1936. It's in each case, these are relatively new and post-colonial states who are still forming their own identities. And yet the borders are all porous. Every single border in the subcontinent has cross-border ethnicities. And frankly, the lines are lines on maps. And even where countries have built fences and so on, it doesn't stop either migration, movement, and trade, which, because it's called illegal, it's become smuggling. But these are things that people have done for centuries, and it will continue. So, in many ways, if you're trying to address these non-traditional security issues, whether it's migration, as I said, whether it's water, which is going to be a big issue in the future as water gets scarcer and scarcer, whether it's energy. These are all issues which probably need regional solutions to start with. Some, like climate change and so on, probably need much more. Even maritime security, if you look at it beyond just security of the high sea, of the sea lanes, and look at it as the ecology and of the, therefore the security of the communities which depend on the sea and the ocean for their livelihood, for instance, the fishing communities and others. Uh, then you're looking at these in a much more integrated way. And you can't just solve them unilaterally. Each state can't take care of itself. You need to do this together with the others. So for me, there is a big incentive to work together with the region and to actually find cooperative solutions. Even if you can't solve them, at least you can mitigate the effects or you can manage the problem and prevent further deterioration in these issues together with partners in the region.
Well, that's a really great answer, and that sort of reminds me, when we think about the region, right? One
Mhm.
of the another coexisting power that's sort of making the waves in international relations as it always does is China. And obviously you were the chair at the Center for China Studies, and I sort of would love to talk about the potential new Cold War between US and China. And actually, a fun tidbit is Professor Menon has actually bought Sir John Cable to Ashoka, and
Mhm.
he delivered a lovely lecture, which is one of my favorite talks in Ashoka. And I'm still in contact with Sir Cable, and I really enjoyed the podcast, the talk, and want to ask what your opinion is on how this new Cold War between the US and China would mean for non-traditional security, especially for India, right? So that's
Mhm.
something that I'm really excited to ask you about.
Well, I'm not sure that Cold War is really the right term for what's happened or is happening between China and the US. Because unlike the Cold War, China and the US are economically joined at the hip. I mean, they're like Siamese twins. They are both actually members of the same global capitalist world economy. Uh, Unlike the Soviet Union and the US, they ran separate economic systems. They were ideologically divided. Frankly, China believes in the market. She might believe in a different political system, way of running her politics, but the market, I mean, that's state capitalism at its most efficient and effective, what they've done. So, and they don't offer an ideological alternative to the rest of the world. I mean, there isn't, it's not like communism offered a completely different way of thinking and approach to life than capitalism did in the Cold War. So I'm a bit nervous of using the word Cold War because it also obscures two or three basic facts. China today is more dependent on the world than she's ever been in her history. You know, 25% of the food that she eats, she imports. She depends on the world for energy. She depends on the world for commodities just to keep her economy going and to produce the exports that she sells to the rest of the world. You know, everyone says, oh, China controls over 90% of the rare earths on the world market. But she actually produces less than 30% of them. She gets them from elsewhere. She processes around 90% of the rare earths which reach the market, which are traded in the world. But that's processing. But in order to do that, she depends on the outside world to actually get the raw materials to run it. And she does it cheaper than anyone else. So people sell it to her because she has therefore control of the market. But that's competitive advantage. It's so there is, for me, actually, this is a very different situation from what we saw in the Cold War between the two of them. What does that do for us? It, frankly, we get, of course, there is always this fear that we will be too dependent on an outside power again. And given our history with the East India Company and so on, we are hypersensitive to this this possibility. But the fact is that even with a political relationship which was in really difficult, especially after Galwan in 2020, but now seems to be improving somewhat. Even with that, China was our largest trading partner in 2022. After that, the US overtook her. If you add services, of course, the US is a bigger economic partner. But for us, the two of them actually represent a huge part of our foreign trade. They're number one, number two, and they keep switching places. So I'm not sure that we would like a Cold War division of the world, and where each of them says to you, choose either me or them. I don't think that's in India's interest. Fortunately, they haven't got to that stage yet. And in fact, if anything, I think they are pulling back from that and going the other way. The interesting part is for all the talk of Cold War, decoupling, de risking, whatever, if you look at the share of world trade in world GDP, it's been steady since 2011. It's between 55 and 60%. It hasn't changed. So it's not as though we are deglobalizing. The nature of globalization is changing. Manufacturing supply chains are getting shorter because people don't trust the system. There's uncertainty in the system. Services supply chains are getting longer, global supply chains. So it's an interesting situation. I I am I don't therefore subscribe to any single formula about how to look at this because I think the situation is evolving every day. I mean, you're going to have Donald Trump has threatened another 25% tariffs on all cars from Monday. Yeah, I think nobody really knows where this is going, what effect that's going to have, but it has made the world situation, the world economic prospects certainly much, much more hazy for everybody. And everybody is hedging against uncertainty. So, what does that do to our non traditional security threats? The more uncertainty, the less the worse the prospects of economic growth, the more the likelihood that we will face some of these issues that I mentioned, migration, for instance, that we will face ecological problems because already the US, the largest economy on earth, has decided drill, baby, drill. They're not interested in, they've actually rolled back several of the climate change measures that had been adopted by the previous administration. So I think we are going to see a qualitative shift in the nature of. Now, this doesn't mean that we should expect, I think, great power war directly. No, if anything, the chances of that are probably diminishing because, as Trump has made it clear, he's not interested in defending Ukraine. He's trying to improve relations with Russia, and he's shown all the signs of wanting to improve relations with China as well, inviting Xi Jinping to his inauguration, etc. So between them, I think the larger powers will probably get along better than they did in the last few years. But that doesn't mean that there won't be space and that you will not see periodic eruptions of local flashpoints, of civil wars, of other. I mean, what Azerbaijan did in Nagorno Karabakh, for instance, to Armenia. You know, everybody's trying their luck. Rwanda tries its luck in DRC, in the Congo. The Houthis try their luck in the Red Sea. I mean, well, the Russians tried their luck in Ukraine. Everybody's doing their bit. Because they see fluidity and uncertainty in the system, and frankly, there isn't a world order that's working anymore, and the multilateral system is pretty ineffective. So each one tries his luck and tries to push his own agenda, and that can lead to all kinds of complications and can lead to both traditional and non traditional security threats of various kinds.
Right,
You know,
Professor.
by the
That
way,
answers.
technology also enables all kinds of things. I mean, you know, globalization also meant that terrorism became globalized. But technology has also empowered people. I mean, in the Red Sea against the Houthis, for instance, Western navies are using $250 million Tomahawk missiles to bring down $20,000, $30,000 drones. I mean, that that's a losing proposition in the long run. But it just shows how cheaper technologies can empower people. You've seen the use of drones and so that becomes, yes, it's a conventional threat, but it also enables non-conventional actors, non-state actors, and so on to actually become real threats, and can, in situations which of civil war, of all kinds, it brings all kinds of other actors into the calculus.
Professor, that answer covered all ambits, all poles. That was wonderful. But building on Srirang's question, but about the potential Cold War between US and China. The phrase Cold War, of course, reminds me of the space race, which was a significant aspect of the Cold War. So, in the current generation today, we see a significant focus on space again. We see militarization of space happening through A.S.I.A testing and many more existential threats coming up in terms of space debris. The lower Earth orbit is becoming increasingly contested and congested, and that in
Mhm.
itself has become a significant non which a secure significant security struggle, which experts some experts say is now space is transitioning into traditional, while some experts continue to say that only four countries currently have military power in space, so it's still pretty you know a niche aspect of non-traditional security, or perhaps even security in general. But my question to you would be, considering that we know we're also doing a panel on space and on diplomacy in space in our conference coming up. So my question to you would be, considering that India is a growing space power, in fact, India is also one of the few countries that have ASAT testing capabilities. How would India balance between the United States Artemis Accords versus the China-Russia collaboration on the ILRS, and how would India balance between these two, power hubs in the space arena? And India sort of just as a middle power has a big, opportunity to balance the world order here. So, how do you think India should play her cards here?
Well, I think much of what we're speaking about in space is right now is hypothetical, because it's not as though, I mean, some of the great powers are actually very dependent on their space assets for their functioning and so on. So these ASAT capabilities become at least a latent threat to them, which becomes a conventional threat, actually. It's no longer. What technology has done is traditionally you fought on land, sea, air, right? Technology has added two whole new domains to that. They've added space and cyber. And so now you have new areas and you have to learn new rules about how to deal with them, how to fight with them, fight in these areas. And that contention, I haven't seen yet a fully developed theory of how contention in these domains actually works. So when you said, how will India balance? You've already assumed that we will balance. I don't think we are here to balance. We are here to pursue our interests. And there is no sign of any real regime, international regime, which will contain the militarization of space, limit it or cap it, or forget about actually rolling it back. Uh, I don't see that coming in the near future. And frankly, you've seen how ineffective the multilateral system has become. There hasn't been any internationally binding agreement on a matter of consequence for the last decade and a half. You might say Paris, but Paris was what? Was an agreement where everybody said, I'll tell you what I'll do, but don't you dare check on what I do. And that's hardly an internationally binding agreement, and you've seen the results anyway of Paris in the last 10 years. So there hasn't been one, and it doesn't seem to me that there are going to be agreed, or at least broadly agreed, international regimes for these domains in the near future. So frankly, the choice between U.S. approaches, and even in cyber, for instance, when you talk of international governance of cyberspace, do you want multi-stakeholder? Do you want This has become very much an argument about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. It's a good theoretical argument. There's wonderful brains being applied to it, but I'm not sure that the practical effect of limiting what's going on in terms of threats, in terms of militarization of both domains, is actually around the corner, or that there's much progress on that, or it's likely in the near future, in the foreseeable future. And there is, I mean, where are those efforts going to come from? Those who speak the most about it and who have the most ideas are the ones who have no capabilities at all in these areas. So, and frankly, the Chinese and Russian approach is sovereignty is everything. In other words, we're free to do what we want. So, uh, I'm a bit hesitant actually about diplomacy in these domains.
Right.
I don't think we'll even achieve what Corpus and the others did for space in the past, which where at least we got declarations of intent. They might not be enforceable, but we got decent declarations of intent, and they did manage, at least for geostationary orbits and so on, to have a sort of regime which worked and which most people still accept.
Right, right. And this discussion sort of reminds me. I want to ask like a bit of an impromptu question here. Recently we're seeing, with events unfolding with Wagner Group and whatnot, we've seen this border between, or this boundary between, the private and the government sector in terms of military, in terms of security, in terms of threats, is being blurred more and more. And in terms of space, I sort of want to pose this question in the sense that, if you see right now, right, for example, the owner of SpaceX is, having a good chunk of power in the White House, and we see him there quite a lot. And even with India, a lot of its space work is being outsourced to all these private companies. So I want to ask you, do you, maybe not right now, but probably in the future, maybe a decade down the line, do you imagine that, if there were to be sort of, this sort of a space conflict, how do you think, these sort of private companies would play a role, and what does that mean for, just non-traditional security and space security, as a whole?
I'm not sure, frankly. I don't think I don't think I can actually answer that question about the role of private companies in possible future conflict in space, because I think it goes way beyond just what they do in space. I think it's a question of the role of private companies in your society and in your polity. In the US, there's always been much more receptivity to it. It's not as though, Dale Carnegie or Henry Ford didn't have influence. And they had strong views also. Henry Ford was pretty anti-Semitic, and there were people, and that line between public, private in the US has always been rather fragile, and a shifting line at that. Whereas if you look at how societies like India or China or Russia, for instance, treat their billionaires, it's very different. Each one is unique. I mean, they're not identical. Each one is unique, but each one has a different way of doing it. So I'm not sure. I think this is a phase we're going through right now where we'll have to see what happens. Uh, for me, the cautionary tale is Korea. You look at how powerful the chaebol were, and yet the heads of these chaebol, most of them actually ended up in jail, one way or the other. When society decided that this was too much power and that the country didn't exist for them, it had to be the other way around. So I think I'm a bit nervous about predicting what role these private, also because the development of technology, you've seen in AI how it appeared until very recently that AI needed huge amounts of money, huge amounts of energy, and would therefore be monopolized by a few very big firms. And then DeepSeek came along and made it open source, made it available, and showed that you could do the same thing much cheaper. There were other ways, there were workarounds which could work. And now there'll be a whole host of imitators of DeepSeek. You don't know what the next step is. But that in itself, I think, has made it clear that those big companies, which everybody thought is going to control the future through AI, that's not guaranteed. And technology has done it. It's not as though this was some great social or political understanding that societies came to. It was just the evolution of technology. So it's an interesting problem, actually, of where it goes. I mean, I love your question, but I wish I had an answer.
Thank you so much for the answer, Professor. With that, I think we'll quickly ask our last question, which is a bit of a heavy one, I'd say. So, considering that you've worked extensively with strategic policy and you have incredible experience with how China works itself. You've seen that China's aggressively expanded its influence over energy supply chains, from securing lithium reserves to controlling shipping routes. My question to you would be, how would India counterbalance the China aspect in the Indo-Pacific? In fact, I would go a little beyond that and even ask, do existing multilateral institutions like BRICS, the IEA, or even the Quad provide enough framework to address the aspects or the problems of non-traditional security? Should India push for new frameworks? How would India reposition itself? Or emerging powers like India would reposition themselves to sort of address issues like these?
I at least two things to the way you frame the problem. One is, I don't think our job is to counterbalance China. Our job is to pursue our interests. There will be places where that requires counterbalancing China, but it doesn't, not necessarily so. It could be that you have some common interest with China. You have a common interest with China, for instance, in the free, safe flow of oil and gas from the Middle East to Asia. And in keeping those sea lanes open, you, China, Japan, Korea have the same interest. The US doesn't necessarily, because she's now self-sufficient on her own. But you have an interest in that. So you have some common interests, you have some interests which diverge. Our job should be to see which of our interests we can pursue, how we can pursue them. China's incidental to that. I don't think we should make our job in life counterbalancing China. And that's, I think, very important to remember, that we have a positive agenda of our own, which we need to pursue. Secondly, I don't think we can rely on multilateral institutions or organizations or start a new one or anything at this time. All these multilateral organizations are basically organizations of member states. If the member states don't agree among themselves, these organizations cannot be effective and efficient. They're only as good as the member states are willing to make them. And if the member states are fighting, then forget the organization. So there's no point blaming the poor UN or the WHO and so on when the member states who constitute it don't agree among themselves. And this is why there hasn't been a binding international agreement for all these for a decade and a half, because the member states are not agreed. We are in an unsettled time where there isn't an existing order. So I would say concentrate on your interests, and certainly for each of these cases, look out to how do you build your resilience? How do you build alternative sources of supply? Whether it's energy, whether it's building up your own capacity in renewables, what you're doing in solar, for instance, what you're trying to do in nuclear, or do you work with other suppliers? Do you work with other countries? There are a million ways of doing that. But forget about what China is doing. You shouldn't be playing man-to-man marking with China. That's purely reactive, and you're sure to lose ultimately. You need to actually get out there, decide what your interests are, and pursue them with or without China. And that's a completely separate exercise. So I would say that energy security for you has to be very high, because it affects the transformation of India. And whichever way you can get to it. I mean, people now talk of hydrogen, people talk of all kinds of ways of doing this. Uh, if China, we think China controls lithium, but there's actually lithium across the world, including in India. And it's a question of the price that you're prepared to pay and whether you're willing to actually go out and do what's necessary. Those are calculations that you'll make on the basis of your interest and your capability, not on the basis of whether China is doing it or not. And that I think we can do. I think we're now at a stage where actually we don't we we have the capability to deal with this kind of disorderly world. We are one of the few economies. After all, you are a big enough and diverse enough economy who can actually do this. And you're still at a level of development where you have infinite potential actually to create outcomes and to grow. And you need to use that. And I think we can actually, in the case that you mentioned, for instance, for energy, I think there are ways forward. Already we don't produce crude oil, but we process and sell petroleum products across the world, to Europe, to other places. And that in many ways is a way of enhancing your own security, your own energy security.
I love that. It's got a pinch of realism in it, and I was just really fascinated by it. Well, thank you so much, Professor. It's been such an enlightening conversation. We've discussed so many things, from traditional security, non-traditional security, the lack of existential threats to India, and how we sort of, come out of an era and we're going into another one. Um, you know, I love discussing, especially the points on energy security and cyber security, how that's sort of a priority for us. And I also love the fact that we discussed our region, and we just I feel like sometimes our discussions are over sort of stretched, and we try and analyze things from a very macro perspective, and we forget that sometimes Aya needs a little bit of micro perspective too. I love the discussion on the U.S. China, perhaps sort of Cold War, but sort of the trade disparity and how that's going, and and I really like the whole thing on space. I'm really excited to see how sort of space unfolds, and that's why I'm really excited to attend our conference as well. And yeah, I really like the last. That was my favorite one, like I said. And the pinch of realism. There's like oregano on pizza. I really liked it. So yes, thank you so much, and yeah.
I think it was a perfect balance. I think any student who hears this would realize that it's not about any sort of count, counterbalancing anyone or giving too much priority to any country. It's about the India way, about thinking about what India needs, and there's a significant focus on focusing on what is good for us rather than trying to compete with people. We're just on our own journey of realizing our potential. I think that was a great takeaway from the podcast and the questions, and it was so exciting to hear you speak, Professor. And before we conclude, I think with our audience, we just like to share something a bit exciting about our upcoming annual conference. It's more than just an event; it's a critical conversation about the future of global security.
Exactly, and to the audience, obviously we've thought about security as this whole top-down mandate, but you know, let us imagine security is not a top-down mandate, but as a dynamic dialogue between global challenges and especially about local realities, and that's the core of what we're exploring on April 11th.
Our conference theme, global risks and global impacts, non-traditional security in the modern era, seeks to decentralize traditional security narratives. We're just asking you guys, how do local communities transform complex security challenges into strategies of resilience?
Exactly, and the conference will explore transnational risks across multiple dimensions. We're covering space security and technological disruption. We're talking about asymmetric technological and cultural threats. That's something I'm really excited for. We're talking about innovative local resilience mechanisms.
The aim with this conference is to question the conventional. We're not just analyzing risks, we're reimagining how societies can respond to them.
And so that's why mark your calendars, April 11th, 2025 at Ashoka University. We're going to have interdisciplinary panel discussions. We're going to have keynote speeches from global experts. We're going to have interactive workshops. And for me personally, this is my favorite networking opportunities for students and professionals. And I'm a part of the outreach department here at Asia. And, networking is something which is so key to young and, senior professionals all across IR.
We're not just hosting a conference, we're creating a space to reimagine security as a collaborative and transformative process. Think anybody who's interested in IR within the Delhi NCR region will come and meet you at Ashoka University. We're also having hybrid participation from multiple universities across the world. So this is the place to be.
So, whether you're a student, a researcher, policymaker, or simply just curious, this is your invitation to be a part of the critical global conversation. Stay tuned for more detail, and thank you so much for attending.
With that, I think Professor Menon, would you like to perhaps give us any closing remarks to end the podcast with?
Well, just to say thank you very much, and I really enjoyed this. I was impressed by the nature of your questions. I just wish I could have had all the answers. But all the very best with the conference. I'm sure you'll be a great success.
Thank you so much, Manan and Professor. And it's been an amazing experience to ask you these questions as well. And yeah, with that, I
I
think we'll
think
conclude.
Asia is incredibly lucky to have you as our first guest for an inaugural episode of the podcast series.
Well, I'm
We're so
flattered.
lucky to have you as a faculty at Ashoka, and we're incredibly excited to see you next semester. I think with
Thank
that,
you.
we will conclude the podcast. I am Nandika Rohit,
I'm Sri Rangaithani.
and thank you so much for joining us today. It's about the India way, about thinking about what India needs, and there's a significant focus on focusing on what is good for us rather than trying to compete with people. We're just on our own journey of realizing our potential. I think that was a great takeaway from the podcast and the questions, and it was so exciting to hear you speak, Professor. And before we conclude, I think with our audience, we just like to share something a bit exciting about our upcoming annual conference. It's more than just an event; it's a critical conversation about the future of global security.
Exactly, and to the audience, obviously we've thought about security as this whole top-down mandate, but let us imagine security is not a top-down mandate, but as a dynamic dialogue between global challenges and especially about local realities, and that's the core of what we're exploring on April 11th.
Our conference theme, global risks and global impacts, non-traditional security in the modern era, seeks to decentralize traditional security narratives. We're just asking you guys, how do local communities transform complex security challenges into strategies of resilience?
Exactly, and a conference will explore transnational risks across multiple dimensions. We're covering space security and technological disruption. We're talking about asymmetric technological and cultural threats. That's something I'm really excited for. We're talking about innovative local resilience mechanisms.
The aim with this conference is to question the conventional. We're not just analyzing risks, we're reimagining how societies can respond to them.
And so that's why mark your calendars, April 11th, 2025 at Ashoka University. We're going to have interdisciplinary panel discussions. We're going to have keynote speeches from global experts. We're going to have interactive workshops. And for me personally, this is my favorite networking opportunities for students and professionals. And I'm a part of the outreach department here at Asia. And, networking is something which is so key to young and, senior professionals all across IR.
We're not just hosting a conference, we're creating a space to reimagine security as a collaborative and transformative process. Think anybody who's interested in IR within the Delhi NCR region will come and meet you at Ashoka University. We're also having hybrid participation from multiple universities across the world. So this is the place to be.
So, whether you're a student, a researcher, policymaker, or simply just curious, this is your invitation to be a part of the critical global conversation. Stay tuned for more detail, and thank you so much for attending.
With that, I think Professor Menon, would you like to perhaps give us any closing remarks to end the podcast with?
Well, just to say thank you very much, and I really enjoyed this. I was impressed by the nature of your questions. I just wish I could had all the answers. But all the very best with the conference. I'm sure you'll be a great success.
Thank you so much, Manan and Professor. And it's been an amazing experience to ask you these questions as well. And yeah, with that, I
I
think we'll
think
conclude.
Asia is incredibly lucky to have you as our first guest for an inaugural episode of the podcast series.
Well, I'm
We're so
flattered.
lucky to have you as a faculty at Ashoka, and we're incredibly excited to see you next semester. I think with
Thank
that,
you.
we will conclude the podcast. I am Nandika Rohit,
I'm Sri Rangaithani.
and thank you so much for joining us today.